Our next segment is brought to you by Engineered Tax Services, where engineering and accounting come together. Joining us here in studio is my former boss, Edward Conard. He's the author of The Upside of Inequality. Welcome back, Ed.
Thanks for having me.
And also joining us via Skype today is John Loudon. He's Vice President of Public Relations at Engineered Tax Services. Welcome, John. You there?
Hey, good to be with you.
Hi, John. So one of President Trump's arguments for lowering corporate tax rates was the increase in workers' wages. Have we seen this happen?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked it that way because, yes, wages are up, and that perhaps is the best news for the average American. And don't forget, the tax cuts were done not to reward corporations or fill the treasury. They were done to stimulate the economy and lead to wage growth. Why do we care that the economy is strong? We care that it's strong so it creates better lives, which stems from wage growth. So yes, wage growth is up 3.1%. Even the hourly workers at the bottom rung are doing well. And that, to me, is the best news of all from the tax cuts.
Mr. Edward Conard, my former boss.
Do I agree with that?
Yes.
Sure, of course I do. I think there's two components to the tax cut. There's the corporate tax cut, which increases investment slowly over time, that leads to a gradual increase in wages. Historically, as we've put more capital per worker, we've seen higher wages per worker as the productivity has gone up. I think there's a second component to it as well, which is there's a short-term stimulus from the middle-class tax cut. I say short-term because it expires 10 years from now. Maybe 10 years isn't the short term, but it's not a permanent increase. But we have very tight utilization in our economy and of our labor force at the moment. So when you stimulate with a middle-class tax cut, whether it's temporary or not, 10 years temporary, it's going to lead to an increase in wages in the short run. I think if you look at the Congressional Budget Office forecast, that piece of it is not sustainable in the long run. The piece that is sustainable is investment by corporations, which increases gradually over the course of 20 years.
So a lot of people I've heard over and over when you mention investment by corporations, they say, no, that's not what's happening. We're actually seeing corporate buybacks, and the money is being bought back and then it's going to the pockets of the wealthy. What's your take on that, your response, Ed?
Well, there's definitely a lot of buybacks. I think that is critical to getting investment in our economy because if you look at the most profitable companies, largely tech companies, I sit on the board of one, for example, we generate a lot more cash than we have investment opportunities and investment ideas. So what do you want us to do with the cash? We can leave it in a bank account and let somebody else borrow it, largely to build a big house, or we can give it back to our shareholders. If you look at the private placement market for debt and equity and venture capital, you'd see the two are about the same size, and that the only way you're going to get money into those markets, those private placement markets, is the companies that are profitable have to dividend it out to shareholders largely by buying back their stock, and then those wealthy investors, because let's face it, it's the wealthy who have the money who make the investments primarily. Some of it's done by pension funds, which are done by the middle class, but a big piece of it is the richest people in our economy. They pour money back into the economy through the private placement markets.
Yep. So in terms of the question, John, the question of 2018 growth, and we just got the report for quarter one of 2019 at 3.2% economic growth. That's pretty high. Do you think this is just a sugar high, or do you think, to Ed's point, is this a longer run game here in terms of growth?
Well, I'm not going to argue with Ed on long-term predictions, but I think I see blue skies for a while, without a doubt. You know, absent some massive world sort of market downturn, but we've defied that. While Europe is struggling, America is a place to put money. So I've got friends in Germany and England, and people there are looking at the U.S. Because we are the dynamic economy that's showing signs of growth. So I think it looks good for a good long time.
So do you think it's too soon to tell if President Trump's tax law can help raise wages?
Well, certainly there is some wage growth now. My biggest concern has been the flooding of workers over the southern border. You have to assume that 1 million people coming across the border with low skills are going to either drain the social services or drain or compete heavily for people at the lowest rung of the ladder for jobs, for those service jobs. But stunningly, Even the hourly workers are seeing 3% wage growth. There is, I don't even know how that's really happening. It's kind of hard for me to explain. I don't know where all those, million annually, which is the average, is almost getting up that way. How those are not hurting our low-skilled workers, but apparently this economy is strong enough to absorb it.
And I want to ask you about the question of debt. There was an op-ed by one of the leaders of the Tea Party movement in the Wall Street Journal saying that if you look at the origins of the Tea Party, part of one of their big gripes was debt and how public debt had expanded so much under Barack Obama. It's now just ballooning even more under what happened with the Republicans in Congress and with President Trump in the White House. So we've got debt. We've also got a burgeoning deficit. Is this problematic for our generation?
So you have to look at debt in two ways. One is if I borrow a lot of money and spend it on consumption, throw a big party, when we're all done, we have no increase in earning capacity to pay the interest on the debt. That hurts future generations. We enjoy the party today, you pay it back in the future. That's not what happened with the tax cut. Another way to think about debt is I go out and I buy a factory and it produces more income than the interest on the debt that I borrowed to buy the factory. That makes my children better off by the difference between how much the factory earns and how much I pay in interest. In the case of the tax cut, if you look at the Congressional Budget Office forecast, it raises GDP. Eventually the middle class tax cut expires. We also roll back the health care mandate, which saves more money than it costs. And the combination of those things are expected by the CBO to produce more tax revenues in the long run than the interest expense on the debt. And so after the middle class tax cut expires, we start paying down the debt at a faster rate than we would have if we hadn't had the tax cut. That makes future generations better off. If you don't see the difference between those two, if all you do is think, hey, I'm buying a factory, it's producing more income than the debt, but I'm poor by the amount of debt, then you'll see it as the first example, which is I just borrowed the money and consumed it. That's bad for the future. So when the Tea Party is complaining about Democratic administrations increasing redistribution, and that's largely being consumed, and we're running up big deficits to do that, that is going to have an impact on future generations. You have to see the difference between those two. I think many people on the left and the right, especially the fiscal conservatives and the Tea Party who write those kind of op-eds, can't really differentiate between those two different
good debt, bad debt.
Yes.
Well, as a former Moody's bond analyst, I used to rate debt, and I like to call it the good debt. So it is an important difference. But in terms of, John, looking at what Ed was saying is that if it's the good debt and we are able to pay it off with cheaper healthcare costs or tax cuts expiring, that's assuming that all things ceteris paribus, it's all staying equal. How do we know that's going to stay equal? Are you concerned about that?
Well, what I'm concerned about is entitlement spending. I don't disagree with anything Ed said. He's absolutely right about the good debt versus bad debt, but we have tremendous healthcare bad debt and Social Security bad debt. We're in trouble, serious trouble, if we don't address entitlements. And what I find amazing is that neither side is really talking about reforming and getting the fraud out of our entitlement system. There is staggering fraud in our entitlement system. In Missouri, when I was a lawmaker there, and Republicans got control for the first time in 52 years, actually 54 years, had both houses and the governor. All we did is ask welfare recipients to reapply annually. Just prove that you're still eligible. 20% of the rolls dropped just by asking, do you remain eligible? That would be a simple federal fix. I think you'd end tremendous fraud. There are people that come to the United States on this chain migration. They'll come here, all the relatives come, they sign up for welfare, and a lot of them turn around, go back to Bangladesh or wherever they're from. Your $500 a week stipend from the federal, or $500 a month or a week or whatever from the federal government, from U.S. taxpayers, may not go real far in the U.S., but makes you the richest guy in town in villages all over the world. So there's tremendous scamming of the system, and we need to address that right away.
Well, so one of my questions is just around the representation of statistics on who's on welfare and things of that nature. So just now, I think you mentioned, John, that you were a policymaker Missouri, correct?
Missouri.
So
I was a senator there.
gotcha. Thank you. That being said, so when we look at how we represent people who are on welfare and entitlement, programs and things of that nature, why is it that sometimes we represent them constantly as this immigrant population when it is actually primarily I would say white rural residents in a state like Missouri? No?
I think most people don't have a problem with the idea that there is a social safety net for those who truly need it. The problem is there is tremendous gaming in the system that crosses colors. I'm not talking about brown immigrants or black immigrants or white immigrants. I'm talking about, by all means, the system is designed for Americans that have a need, and in some cases, immigrants who fell into a position where they have a need. What we have is wholesale gaming of the system by people who know how to work it. Even the IRS is scandalized. They're handing out $4,000 child tax credit checks. There was one accountant in, I believe it was Indiana, who said that he knows he's got these people coming in claiming they have 8 kids, and he knows they don't, but they file a return and they get a $32,000 check from the federal government.
All right, John, we got to wrap there. We'll have you back to talk about immigration and the debt and questions around that. So we appreciate you joining us, John.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ed, for joining us here in studio.